The first time Jonah Hale saw the bobcat sit through his evening prayers, the mountain had already gone blue around the edges. A thin October wind moved down from the ridge, carrying the smell of damp leaves, wood smoke, and cold creek stones. The porch light over Jonah's cabin had just begun to glow, weak and amber, against the coming dark. Beyond the cedar fence, where the pasture gave way to laurel thickets and black gum trees, something low and silent settled into the grass. Jonah had already bowed his head. He sat on the old prayer bench beside the porch steps, both hands folded over a small brown prayer book, softened at the corners by years of use. The bell he rang each evening hung from a bent nail on the porch post, still trembling faintly from his touch. It was a little brass bell, no bigger than a teacup, and its sound never traveled far. Just enough for the yard, just enough for him. Then he felt watched, not hunted, not threatened, simply noticed. Jonah lifted his eyes slowly, the way a man did when he had spent enough time around wild things to understand that sudden movement could close a door before it had fully opened. At first, he saw only the fence rails, the frost-pale tips of grass, and the dark mouth of the woods. Then the bobcat turned her head. Her eyes caught the porch light. They were not soft eyes, not in the way people wished wild eyes to be soft. They were amber and sharp, fixed on him from a safe distance, full of calculation and old caution. Her body stayed pressed low, but she was not running. Her short tail gave one tight flick. One ear, the left, had a small V-shaped notch cut from its edge. Over her right eye, a pale diagonal scar broke the reddish-brown fur like a tiny line of moonlight. Jonah did not speak. The kettle inside the cabin gave a tired whistle and then stopped, as if it too had understood the need for quiet. A chickadee fussed from the gutter, outraged by the cold. Somewhere behind the shed, the loose latch on the chicken coop clicked twice in the wind, though the chickens themselves had long been asleep. Jonah kept his hands still on the prayer book. The bobcat sat. That was the thing he would remember later. Not that she came near. She did not. Not that she trusted him. She surely did not. Not that she needed him, though something in the narrowness of her shoulders suggested hunger had been following her for a while. What stayed with him was the sitting. A wild bobcat did not waste stillness. She used it. She listened through it. Her body held every sound at once. The porch boards cooling, the dry leaves rubbing together, Jonah's breath, the distant creek worrying over stone. Her whiskers angled forward. Her nose lifted once, testing the evening. When Jonah shifted his thumb against the edge of the prayer book, her ears twitched, but she did not rise. Jonah lowered his gaze again. The words on the page blurred in the dimming light, but he knew them by memory. He had said them in rain, in snow, with tired knees, and with an empty chair visible through the kitchen window behind him. He had said them when he meant them. He had said them when he only hoped meaning would return, if he stayed faithful to the habit. That evening, with a scarred bobcat sitting beyond his fence, the prayer came out smaller than usual. "Keep what is wild safe," he whispered, "and keep what is lonely from hardening." The bobcat blinked once. It would have been easy to make too much of that. Jonah had lived long enough not to mistake a blink for an answer. She was a creature of muscle, scent, hunger, weather, and memory. She owed him nothing. The woods had shaped her far more than any human kindness ever could. Still, the little movement touched him. He had learned not to expect wild things to stay. Near his boot, a brown oak leaf spun in a tiny circle against the porch leg and refused to blow away. The sight made him almost smile. Inside, the kettle sat forgotten on the stove, and the tea he had meant to make would turn bitter before he remembered it. On the railing beside him, he had left half a biscuit wrapped in a napkin, meant for himself, though he suspected the old possum under the smokehouse had already made plans for it. The bobcat watched the biscuit for one long second, then looked away with such offended dignity that Jonah nearly laughed. "Fair enough," he murmured. His voice was no louder than the wind. She stood at once, not panicked, not fleeing blindly, just rising into herself, careful and complete. Her paws moved without sound through the grass. For a moment, her spotted coat broke apart among the shadows, rosettes and tawny fur becoming leaf, bark, dusk. Then she stopped beside the fence post where the wire sagged and looked back. Jonah did not lift a hand. He did not call her pretty. He did not tell her she was safe. Humans were always too quick with words like that, and animals were often wise enough not to believe them. He simply sat with his book open and let the quiet hold. For anyone listening to this story, if it settled gently in the heart, a quiet like or subscription would help keep these little campfire memories alive. And if there was an animal that once changed the shape of a day or a life, the porch always had room for the name of that animal and the place where the listening began. Jonah would not have known how to say any of that out loud. He was not a man who asked much from others. He fixed his own fences, cut his own firewood, patched the same jacket every autumn, and drank his tea from a chipped green mug because buying a new one felt like admitting the old life was gone. But as he watched the bobcat vanish into the laurel, he felt something in the evening shift. The prayer bench no longer faced only an empty yard. The bell's fading notes seemed to linger among the cedar posts. The porch light drew a small golden square on the frost. Jonah sat until the cold worked through his sleeves and into his elbows. He listened for her, though he knew better than to expect footsteps from the bobcat. Nothing came back from the woods, only the wind, only the creek, only the strange and tender ache of having been joined, for a few minutes, by a wild creature who had refused the porch, refused the food, refused the comfort of walls, and yet had chosen, for reasons Jonah could not name, to sit near the sound of his evening prayers. Jonah Hale had been 59 that autumn, though most folks in Briar Hollow would have guessed older on the mornings when he came into town with sawdust on his cuffs and the quiet look of a man who had spent too many evenings answering only to the stove. His cabin sat 3 miles above the county road, where the Blue Ridge foothills rose in folded shadows, and the mail carrier only came when the weather allowed it. The place had once belonged to his wife's grandfather, a square-shouldered little house with a tin roof, a stone chimney, and a porch that leaned slightly left, as if it were tired but too stubborn to fall. Jonah had promised Elise he would fix that porch one spring, then spring had come and gone without her. Since then, he had mended everything except the things that mattered most. He worked part-time repairing hymnals and old family Bibles for churches in 3 counties. His hands were broad, scarred, and careful, better with thread and glue than with conversation. On clear mornings, he drove to a room behind the Briar Hollow Chapel, where damaged books waited in neat stacks. On other days, he worked at his kitchen table with the window open just enough to hear the creek below the pasture. He liked work that did not demand quick answers. Before breakfast, he fed the chickens, though he talked to them only when one acted insulted by corn. He filled the wood box before noon. At 2, he drank tea from Elise's green mug, the one with a chip near the handle, shaped almost like a tiny bird. At 4, he walked the fence line with a coil of wire over one shoulder, checking posts, latches, and the sagging place near the laurel thicket. That habit had begun long before grief gave it weight. Elise had started it because she said a house should know when the day was ending. She would ring the little brass bell, wipe flour from her hands, and sit beside him on the prayer bench while the mountain gathered itself into evening. Some nights they spoke full prayers. Some nights they only sat there, shoulder to shoulder, listening to barred owls trade low calls across the hollow. After she passed, Jonah kept ringing the bell, because stopping felt like closing the last open window. The first year, his neighbors tried to draw him back toward living. Mrs. Calder brought chicken stew and scolded him for returning the pot too clean. Deacon Avery asked him to help repaint the chapel steps, then quietly let him work alone when conversation became too much. A 12-year-old boy named Caleb Pike left paper bags of apples on Jonah's porch with crooked notes that said, "For Mr. Hale, not for raccoons," though raccoons read no warnings and obeyed even fewer. He appreciated them all, but kept his distance. It was not bitterness that held him apart. It was something duller and harder to explain. He had spent 40 years being known by another person in small ways. How he disliked sugar in tea, but liked the spoon left in the cup. How his left knee ached before rain. How he saved the heel of every loaf for Elise because she liked it toasted dark. Without her, he felt unfinished in public, as though everyone could see the missing part. A man could survive a great deal if he knew when to sweep the porch. The mountain had its own routines, too. In October, the maples reddened along the creek first. The chipmunks became reckless near the woodpile. The crows gathered in the upper pasture and shouted at things no one else could see. At night, wild shapes moved through the dark, beyond every fence Jonah had repaired. He respected them. He had seen bobcats before, though rarely close. A flash of spotted flank crossing the logging road, a short tail disappearing over a stone wall. Once, in late winter, yellow eyes above the creek bank, watching him so steadily that he backed away without knowing why. Bobcats belonged to the between places, brush edges, ledges, dry creek beds, the last strip of light before dark. They were not visitors, they were residents who allowed humans to be briefly unaware of how much they were being observed. Jonah likes that about them. He had never wanted wildness softened just so people could feel chosen by it. That was why, when the notched-eared female began appearing beyond his fence, he did not rush to name what was happening. He did not tell Mrs. Calder. He did not set out a saucer like she was a barn cat. He did not fetch a camera, though Caleb would have begged to see a picture. He simply added her to the long list of things the mountain had asked him to notice. Fox tracks under the persimmon tree, a broken blue eggshell after a storm, the way the creek smelled metallic before heavy rain. Still, after that first evening, Jonah caught himself preparing for dusk with more care. He brushed sawdust from the prayer bench. He tightened the porch latch so it would not clatter and startle anything in the yard. He moved the biscuit tin away from the railing after remembering her dignified refusal. He even oiled the bell chain, then felt foolish for doing it, as though a bobcat might judge a man by the squeak in his porch hardware. The foolishness warmed him. One evening, while carrying kindling inside, he found a small paw print pressed into damp mud near the sagging fence. 4 rounded toes, no claw marks. Light, neat, deliberate. He crouched beside it until his knees complained, touching nothing. The print faced the porch. Jonah stayed there a long while, one hand resting on the wire, the smell of wet cedar rising around him. He thought of Elise ringing the bell with flour on her wrist. He thought of the empty half of the bench. He thought of how loneliness sometimes made a man mistake any presence for comfort, and how dangerous that could be for a wild creature. When he stood, he made himself a promise. He would not ask the bobcat to become anything other than what she was. If she came, she came. If she vanished, the woods would have received back what was always theirs. But that night, when he opened the prayer book and the bell gave its small, bright note, Jonah found himself leaving a little more space beside the silence than before. Jonah did not first find the bobcat at prayer. He found her 4 afternoons earlier, on a gray day when the mountains smelled of rain. The sky had lowered itself over Briar Hollow until the ridgeline looked smudged, and the creek below the pasture pushed brown leaves along its stones. Jonah had been walking the fence line with a pair of pliers in his coat pocket and a coil of wire knocking against his hip. The sagging stretch near the laurel thicket had bothered him for weeks. Deer had been slipping through there at night. Jonah meant to tighten 2 staples and be back inside before the first drops came. He was kneeling in wet grass when the chickens went silent. That was what made him look up. Chickens complained about everything: wind, leaves, their own shadows. The rooster, Amos, had once carried on because Jonah set a bucket beside the coop instead of behind it. But this silence fell all at once, like a quilt dropped over the yard. Jonah stayed still. From the laurel came a sound so faint he might have missed it in younger years, when the house had still been full of Elise. It was not a cry, not quite, more like breath caught against pain, a rough little exhale hidden beneath the rain smell. He turned his head slowly. At first, he saw only the tangled green of mountain laurel, its leaves glossy and dark, holding beads of mist along their edges. Then a shape separated from the undergrowth: tawny fur, spotted flank, a short black-tipped tail drawn tight against the body. A bobcat lay half in shadow beneath the lowest branches. She was young, full-grown but not old, with a winter coat just beginning to thicken along her shoulders. Mud darkened one side of her chest. Burrs clung to the white ruff of her face. Her left ear held that sharp V-notch, and above the right eye ran a pale diagonal scar. One front paw was tucked beneath her, while her back leg rested at an angle that made Jonah's chest draw in. Amber, hard, furious with fear, the bobcat opened her mouth without sound. Her whiskers trembled. When Jonah shifted his weight, she tried to rise and failed, with a wild creature's stubborn refusal to let weakness be witnessed. She pushed up with her front legs, swayed, then sank back into the leaves, breathing fast through her nose. Jonah looked away for one careful second. It felt wrong to stare at Tame that proud. Easy, he said, though he knew the word meant nothing to her. The rooster chose that moment to remember he was alive and gave one thin, uncertain cluck from the coop. Jonah almost thanked him for it. Behind the shed, a squirrel scolded everyone involved from the safety of a hickory limb. The bobcat's ears flicked toward both sounds, measuring danger in every direction. Jonah backed away. Not far. He had known men who believed kindness meant stepping closer. Jonah had never trusted that kind of kindness. Around wild things, gentleness often meant giving space until your own need to help stopped being the loudest thing in the yard. He eased one boot behind the other, feeling the soaked grass lick cold against his cuffs. The coil of wire slid from his shoulder and landed with a soft metallic sigh. The bobcat flinched, flattening herself against the leaves. Jonah froze until her breathing steadied. Inside the cabin, the familiar objects seemed suddenly too ordinary. The green mug beside the sink. Elisa's flour tin, still used though Jonah baked nothing more ambitious than cornbread. The prayer book lying open on the table where he had left it that morning. He stood in the doorway and felt the old ache of having no one to call into the room. For years, trouble had made him turn toward Elise before he turned toward the phone. Now he reached for the phone alone. He called the county wildlife office first and got a recording. Then he called the number printed on a faded magnet stuck to his icebox. Cedar Ridge Wildlife Rescue answered on the fourth ring. A woman named Mara Voss listened without interrupting. "Do not approach her," Mara said. "Do not try to touch her. Can you see if she's breathing steadily?" "Fast," Jonah said, looking through the kitchen window. "But steady enough." "Any blood?" "None that I can see." "Good. Keep distance. Keep pets and chickens secured. If you can place water nearby without going close, do it only when she isn't ready to bolt. I'll start up the mountain." Jonah looked at the gray sky pressing lower over the trees. Road soft after the culvert. I've driven worse. Before Mara arrived, Jonah did what little he could without making the bobcat's world smaller. He closed the coop door while Amos muttered as if deeply inconvenienced by rescue ethics. He moved a shallow metal pan of water to the edge of the yard, then retreated so slowly his knees felt twice their age. The bobcat watched every inch of him. When the pan tipped slightly and made a hollow wobble, her lips pulled back, and Jonah stopped breathing until she settled again. Rain finally began, thin as thread. It dotted the porch rail and gathered on the bobcat's whiskers. She did not drink while he watched. She only lowered her chin onto the leaves, eyes never leaving him, as if memorizing the man who had found her weak and not made it worse. Jonah waited on the porch with his coat collar up and his hands empty. He did not pray then, not with words, but he sat under the dim sky, listening to rain tick against the tin roof, and felt something quiet inside him bend toward the laurel. Not ownership, not even hope, just a careful sorrow, the kind that recognized another living creature trying hard not to disappear. When Mara's truck finally growled up the muddy drive, Jonah lifted one hand without taking his eyes from the thicket. The bobcat's tail flicked once. Even hurt, she saw everything. Mara Voss arrived with mud on the sides of her truck and calm in every movement. She was 43, with silver beginning at her temples and a canvas jacket that smelled faintly of pine shavings and antiseptic. She stepped out slowly, left the truck door open, and did not look directly toward the laurel at first. Jonah noticed that. Mara only listened. She stood in the drizzle with one hand resting on the hood, taking in the silence of the chickens, the water pan, the thicket, and the faint rasp of breath beneath the glossy leaves. Female, she said quietly. Young adult, maybe 2 years. Thin, but not gone yet. The words "not gone yet" settled on Jonah with unexpected weight. The bobcat watched from under the laurel, ears flattened, body low, every muscle prepared for the impossible choice between fleeing and staying alive. A raindrop slid from one whisker and hung there bright as glass. She's favoring the rear leg, Mara said. Could be a strain, could be bruising from a fall, could be a close call with a vehicle. If she can move, trapping her may do more harm than good tonight. We'll support her and watch. If she worsens, we intervene. Jonah wanted an answer with a door he could shut. Bring her in, fix her, keep her warm, make the fear stop. Instead, Mara offered him weather, distance, and waiting. She showed Jonah how to place water and later small portions of appropriate food far enough away that the bobcat did not feel cornered. No crowding, no calling, no trying to make a friend out of a patient. 3 feet closer, only when the animal's body allowed it, and sometimes 3 feet back was the kinder direction. She chooses the space, Mara told him. You provide the chance. Jonah repeated that while the rain darkened his sleeves. The first meal was hardly a meal at all. Mara left a small amount near the fence line after the bobcat had dragged herself deeper under the laurel. Then she and Jonah retreated to the porch. Amos walked safely in the coop, protested through the wall with wounded dignity. Mara's mouth twitched, but she did not laugh loudly. The bobcat waited almost 20 minutes. Then the spotted face appeared between the leaves. She circled once, vanishing and reappearing through brush, as if measuring every scent from several angles. Her paws placed themselves neatly, without claw marks, even in mud. When an acorn dropped from the oak and struck the ground behind her, she sprang sideways, offended at the whole tree. Jonah let out the smallest breath of amusement. Mara glanced at him. They do not appreciate surprises. Neither do I much. It was the first thing like humor Jonah had said to a stranger in months. The young female finally ate, quickly, cautiously. She took 2 bites, lifted her head, listened, then took another. Her damaged leg trembled when she shifted weight, but she stayed upright. Afterward, she did not look grateful. She looked suspicious of everyone's motives, including the food's. Then she slipped back under the laurel and became nothing but wet leaves. Mara returned the next morning, and the morning after that. She checked the tracks, studied what had been eaten, and taught him the difference between hunger and dependency, between help and invitation, between keeping a creature alive and teaching it to rely on doors. Jonah listened. He wrote instructions on the back of an old church bulletin because he could not find a notebook. Keep portions small. Change water at dawn. Stay back. No porch feeding. No touching. Call if breathing changed. Call if she stopped moving. Call if she approached people. He underlined that last one twice. By the 3rd evening, the bobcat had moved from the laurel to a dry hollow beneath a fallen poplar beyond the fence. It was safer there, tucked between roots and fern stems. Jonah could see only part of her from the porch. One ear, the pale scar, the lift and fall of her side. He began placing the food at the same time each day, always before dusk, always in the same shallow brown dish Mara had left. The bobcat disliked the dish. She dragged the food out with one paw and ate it beside the dish. Jonah pretended not to notice. 3 feet became a lesson. At first, he stopped near the chicken coop. Then, when her ears no longer flattened at the sight of him, he stopped by the rain barrel. Later, by the split cedar post. Each distance had to be earned twice, then surrendered once, because trust did not move straight. Some afternoons, she vanished until Jonah's worry sharpened, only to reappear on a rock above the creek, grooming one shoulder. She cleaned her injured leg with careful strokes, pausing often to listen. Once, she sneezed after sniffing a crushed mint plant near the fence, then gave the plant such a stern look that Jonah carried the memory inside all day. He did not name her yet. Naming felt like reaching. Still, his mind began making room for her. While gluing a torn hymnal page at the kitchen table, he heard a leaf scrape the porch and lifted his head. While pouring tea into the chipped green mug, he caught himself checking the laurel before the cup was full. Somewhere beyond the fence, another life was negotiating pain, weather, hunger, and pride. That humbled him. Jonah had thought grief made him patient. It had not. It had only made him still. The bobcat was teaching him the difference. By the 7th evening, Mara stood beside him, near the porch steps, and watched the young female limp to the food with more strength than before. The bobcat stopped, turned her scarred face toward them, and held still for 5 long breaths. Jonah did not move. Mara whispered, "That's good." The bobcat lowered her head and ate. Not tame, not safe in any human sense, but less afraid of the shape Jonah made in her world. When the little brass bell rang later that night for prayer, she remained beyond the fence beneath the poplar roots, eyes open, ears forward, listening from exactly the distance she had chosen. The first still evening came after 3 days of dry weather. By then, the rain had moved east, leaving the mountain rinsed and sharp beneath a pale sky. Fallen leaves clung to the pasture grass in copper patches, and the creek below Jonah's cabin ran clearer, speaking over the stones in a calmer voice. The air smelled of split cedar, damp earth, and the last wild asters blooming stubbornly along the fence. Mercy had not been called mercy by anyone but Jonah's own careful thoughts. He had not said the name aloud. It had come to him one morning while he repaired a torn hymnal page at the kitchen table. A corner of paper had curled under his thumb, fragile as dried grass, and outside the window, The bobcat had limped along the fence with her head low and her ears moving independently, one toward the coop, one toward the woods. She looked like no one's idea of mercy. She looked wary, hungry, offended by weakness, and prepared to vanish from any kindness that came too close. Still, the name had risen in him, Mercy, not because she was gentle, because she had survived. Jonah kept the name folded inside himself like a note he was not ready to mail. That evening, he finished chores earlier than usual. He carried kindling to the porch, checked the coop latch twice, and changed the water pan near the split cedar post. Amos the rooster watched him through the wire, as if supervising every movement. One of the hens pecked at Jonah's bootlace and then strutted away, proud of her contribution. "Much obliged," Jonah murmured. Beyond the fence, Mercy lay beneath the fallen poplar roots. Only the upper half of her face showed through the fern stems. Her amber eyes followed the hen with intense disapproval, though she made no move toward the coop. Her injured leg had improved enough that she no longer sank after 3 steps, but she still favored it when turning. Sometimes she placed the paw down, lifted it again, and looked at the ground as if the earth had made a personal mistake. Jonah had learned to read small changes. Her ears no longer pinned flat every time he opened the cabin door. She no longer vanished when he crossed the porch. Once, when he sneezed while carrying firewood, she had shot him a look so sharp he had apologized before remembering she was a bobcat. The apology had made him smile for nearly an hour. He placed the evening food at the agreed distance and stepped back to the porch. Mercy waited, as always. She watched the yard, the tree line, the chicken coop, the roof, the sky. A leaf loosened from the white oak and drifted down in a lazy spiral. Her head tilted to follow it. When it landed on her back, she flinched, twisted, and shook it off with such wounded dignity that Jonah had to press his lips together. She ate after the shadows touched the lower fence rail. Not much, enough. Then she moved toward the weeds beside the pasture gate instead of returning to the poplar roots. That was new. Jonah noticed but did not stare. He had come to understand that attention could be too heavy even when it meant no harm. He went inside, washed his hands, and poured tea into the chipped green mug. The tea had cooled before he drank it. He carried it out anyway, because the warmth of the cup mattered more than the taste. The porch boards gave their familiar soft complaint under his boots. Dusk gathered. The prayer bench waited beside the steps, worn smooth in the center from years of use. Jonah brushed away 2 dry leaves and sat down carefully. His left knee ached in the cooling air. He set the prayer book across his lap and reached for the little brass bell. For a moment, he hesitated. He had rung that bell every evening for so long that the motion belonged less to thought than to muscle. But now he knew the sound traveled beyond his grief. It crossed the yard. It entered the weeds. It reached ears that could hear a mouse under snow and a beetle under bark. He rang it softly. The note opened into the evening, small and bright. At the fence line, Mercy rose. Jonah's hand remained on the bell chain. The bobcat stood half hidden among goldenrod stems, gone brown with frost. Her body faced the woods, ready to leave. Her head faced him. The notch in her left ear made a tiny break in her silhouette. The scar above her eye caught the last light. Jonah expected her to slip away. Instead, she sat. Not close, not relaxed. Her muscles remained gathered beneath her, and her tail tip twitched once against the grass. But she did not run from the bell. She did not flatten herself. She did not retreat to the roots. She sat in the weeds and listened. The prayer book suddenly felt heavier on Jonah's knees. He lowered his eyes, because looking directly at her felt like asking for too much. The words came slowly. Some were familiar. Some were only breath shaped into gratitude. He prayed for the mountain, for neighbors whose names he spoke softly, for Mrs. Calder's sore hands, for Caleb Pike's school troubles, for Mara Voss and all the animals she carried back toward strength. Then, after a long pause, he prayed for the creature at the fence without naming her. "Let her keep what belongs to her," he whispered, "and let me not confuse help with keeping." The wind moved through the weeds. Mercy's ears turned toward his voice, then toward the creek, then back again. She lifted one paw and tucked it neatly beneath her chest. It was not affection. Jonah knew that. It was comfort only in the smallest, wildest sense. His sound had become part of the evening and not a reason to flee. That was enough to undo him more gently than sorrow ever had. Inside the cabin, the kettle clicked as it cooled. Amos gave one sleepy croak from the coop. A moth bumped twice against the porch light, determined and foolish. Jonah's tea sent up a thin ribbon of steam that smelled faintly of mint. When the prayer ended, he did not say amen loudly. He only closed the book. Mercy remained a moment longer. Then she stood, stretched her injured leg with cautious care, and stepped back through the weeds. Before the laurel took her, she paused to rub one cheek against the rough cedar post, leaving a scent Jonah could not read, but understood was not meant for him. Still, it felt like a signature. The yard darkened after she disappeared. Jonah sat until the mug cooled in his hands, feeling the little bell's silence settle around him. For the first time in many months, the quiet beside him did not feel entirely empty. By late October, Mercy had become part of Jonah's day without ever belonging to it. She did not come when called, because Jonah never called. She did not sleep on the porch, because the porch belonged to people, boards, lamplight, and the old smell of soap from the cabin door. She did not let him touch her, and he never tried. Yet her presence threaded itself through the hours so quietly that Jonah sometimes discovered he had been arranging his movements around her before he knew he was doing it. Morning began with frost silvering the pasture and the tin roof ticking as the first pale sun warmed it. Jonah stepped outside with feed, his breath showing white, and Mercy's tracks were stitched along the fence line. 4 small toes, no claws, a drift around the rain barrel, a pause near the woodpile, then a trail bending toward the creek. She was a ghost with paws. Amos the rooster took personal offense to every track. He stood inside the coop with his chest puffed, giving short, important clucks as if filing a complaint with the county. Jonah scattered corn and said, "I'll pass that along." Mercy usually appeared after the sun reached branches. She crossed beyond the cedar fence in quick, low movements, never walking straight if a crooked path would do. Sometimes she paused on a flat stone above the creek, where light caught the pale scar above her right eye. Sometimes she sat beneath the sumac and washed one paw with stern concentration, dragging it over her ear as if polishing a secret. The limp faded by degrees. Mara came less often now, pleased but cautious. A healing bobcat was still a bobcat, especially a young female with cover, appetite, and a territory to reclaim. "She's using you as one safe edge," Mara told him. Jonah held the chipped green mug. "Is that bad?" "Not if the edge stays an edge." He carried that sentence around for days. An edge, not a home, not a claim. He placed food only when Mara advised it, never near the porch, and never enough to make hunting unnecessary. He washed the water pan each morning and set it where Mercy could reach it without crossing too much open ground. He fixed the sagging fence, not to trap her out, but to make the boundary plain. The lowest wire remained high enough for her to slip beneath, if she chose. The yard learned her. Leaves gathered differently where she passed. The grass near the split cedar post flattened where she rested. A patch of bark on the fence grew smooth from her cheek rubs, though Jonah did not touch it. Once, he found a brown feather beside the water pan. He looked at it and said, That a thank you or a warning? Mercy, watching from the weeds, blinked with no interest in clarifying. The house learned her too. Jonah stopped letting the screen door slap shut. He moved his work table closer to the kitchen window so he could mend hymnals while seeing the fence. The cabin filled with small sounds, the scrape of his chair, the sigh of pages under repair, walnuts falling on the shed roof. At 2 o'clock, he still drank tea. Sometimes Mercy appeared while the cup was steaming. She seemed to dislike the steam. Each time it curled from the mug, her nose wrinkled, and once she backed away with such suspicion that Jonah set the cup behind the post. "You'd hate Mrs. Calder's soup," he whispered. Mercy turned her head toward the creek. He counted that as agreement. The evenings became the center of everything. Jonah finished chores before the light thinned. He checked the coop latch, though Amos objected to the ceremony. He swept the prayer bench with his palm and made sure the little brass bell hung free. Then he sat with the prayer book open and waited until the mountain changed color. Mercy rarely missed it. She came from different places, never making a habit too easy to read. One night from the laurel, one night from the creek path, once from behind the smokehouse, which startled Jonah so badly that he dropped his folded handkerchief. Mercy sprang backward at the same instant, equally offended, and for several breaths, man and Bobcat stared at one another as if both had been caught doing something foolish. Jonah laughed first, not loudly, just enough to loosen his chest. For a long time after Elise died, laughter had felt disloyal, like opening a door she could not walk through with him. But Mercy's indignant hop, the handkerchief lying between them, and Amos making a muffled noise from the coop, all worked together against Brief's stern rules. Jonah laughed, and the evening did not punish him. Mercy sat at the fence when the bell rang. Sometimes she kept her injured legs stretched slightly forward. Sometimes she tucked both front paws beneath her chest, making herself look like a loaf-shaped shadow with ears. She always kept her body angled toward escape. Even in calm, she belonged to leaving. Jonah began to understand why her company mattered. She did not sit with him because walls held her. She sat because, for that short blue hour, the sound of his bell and his low voice had become acceptable to her wild heart. The prayer changed in those weeks. It became less about asking the empty house to feel full again. It became more about noticing what had come near without being summoned. Frost on the rail, Mercy's amber eyes beyond the fence, Caleb's apple bags, Mrs. Calder's stew, the stubborn rooster. Each small thing did not heal Jonah, but each one kept him from turning away. One night, after the prayer ended, Mercy remained under the cedar post, head lifted toward the porch light. A pale moth circled above Jonah's shoulder, tapping the glass shade. Mercy watched it until it drifted lower. Then she made one small silent leap. She missed. The moth escaped into the dark. Mercy landed with dignity, sat down, and washed her chest as though that had been her plan all along. Jonah smiled down at the prayer book in his lap. The mountain wind moved through the fence wire. Mercy finished grooming, glanced once toward him, and slipped back under the lowest rail toward the woods. She left nothing behind but paw prints in the frost. By morning, the sun would soften them away. Still, Jonah found himself rising earlier to see them before they disappeared. The first hard frost came on a Sunday morning, glazing the pasture grass so white that Jonah hesitated before stepping off the porch. The boards under his boots held the night's cold. His breath drifted in front of him, and every fence rail shone beneath ice. Down by the creek, rhododendron leaves had curled tight. The whole hollow seemed to be waiting for sunlight. Mercy had crossed the yard before dawn. Jonah saw her tracks before anything else. They came from the laurel, curved beneath the lowest fence wire, circled the water pan, then wandered toward the prayer bench. Not onto the porch, never that, but close enough that one print rested in the frost beside the bottom step, delicate and complete. He stood over it with the feed bucket in one hand. For several breaths he did not move. It was only a paw print. By noon it would be gone. Yet Jonah felt the small mark reach deep, because grief had taught him how easily proof disappeared. A voice from the next room, a handprint in flour dust, a coat on a peg. Ordinary things became holy after they stopped renewing themselves. Amos complained from the coop, reminding him that holiness did not excuse late breakfast. "All right," Jonah said. "I see you're starving." The rooster strutted as though he had saved the morning. Mercy watched from the stone wall near the creek while Jonah scattered feed. She sat with her front paws tucked beneath her chest, the black tip of her bobbed tail pressed against the rock. Frost silvered the whiskers on the right side of her muzzle. When Amos crowed, Mercy narrowed her eyes with such weary judgment that Jonah had to turn away before a laugh startled her. The laugh came anyway, soft and brief. It surprised him less now. That was the quiet joy of those weeks, not happiness as people often described it, bright and loud, but something smaller, like a coal under ash. It glowed when Mercy leapt at a blowing leaf and landed as if she had meant only to inspect the ground. It warmed him when Caleb Pike left apples with a note reading, "Still not for raccoons, probably not for bobcats either." It stirred when Mrs. Calder accused Jonah of looking less like a haunted fence post and pretended she had not said anything kind. Mercy did not make Jonah whole, but she made the evenings wider. On that Sunday, after chapel, Jonah came home with 2 repaired hymnals and a piece of lemon cake Mrs. Calder had forced into his hand. She claimed it was extra. Jonah knew better. Mrs. Calder did not believe in extra cake. She believed in directing cake toward people who needed watching. He set the slice on a plate and took it outside with tea when the sun leaned west. Mercy appeared as he sat on the porch step, not at the fence, but on the fallen poplar beyond it. The injury had nearly left her by then. She moved with more smoothness each day, placing her back paw lightly but firmly. When she jumped down from the log, she landed in silence, then paused to sniff at mushrooms with suspicion. Jonah lifted his fork. "I don't trust them either," he murmured. Mercy turned one ear toward him and the other toward the woods. He ate the lemon cake slowly. A crumb fell onto his coat. Before he could brush it away, a chickadee darted from the railing, stole it, and vanished into the dogwood. Jonah looked at the empty spot on his sleeve. Mercy looked too. For a moment, man and bobcat seemed to share the same astonishment at the boldness of birds. The afternoon softened into evening. Gold drained from the trees and left the trunks dark against a lavender sky. Jonah carried the plate inside, rinsed his mug, and returned with the prayer book. His steps had become part of the ceremony. The screen door eased shut. The porch board sighed. The bench received his weight. The bell chain cooled his fingers. Beyond the fence, Mercy took her place near the cedar post. Not every evening had been like that. Some nights she stayed hidden. Some nights she crossed the pasture edge, restless with scents Jonah could not read. Some nights an owl called, and she vanished before the bell. But when she sat, the yard became a chapel wider than walls. Jonah rang the bell. The note trembled across frost and brass. Mercy's eyes half closed. Not sleeping, never that careless, but easing into watchfulness that no longer bristled at his voice. She licked one paw and drew it over her scarred brow, then stopped when Jonah turned a page. The look she gave the paper was so stern that Jonah whispered, "I'll try to keep up." Dry leaves whispered along the fence. Somewhere in the woods, a branch cracked under a passing deer. Jonah prayed less for rescue now and more for right distance. He prayed for the wisdom to leave wildness unowned. He prayed for Caleb, Mrs. Calder, and Mara's steady hands. He prayed for animals that crossed roads after dark and people who did not see them in time. He prayed for his own heart, which had spent 2 years trying to become smaller. As he spoke, Mercy settled lower in the grass. She was not listening as a person listened. Jonah knew that. She listened as a bobcat listened, with ears, whiskers, paws, skin, and every memory of danger held ready. Yet she stayed, through his words, through the bells fading, through the quiet afterward. That staying became a gift, because it was never promised. When the prayer ended, Jonah did something he had not done since Elise died. He remained on the bench and hummed the first line of an old hymn. Just a thread of melody, low enough to belong to the porch light. Mercy lifted her head. The sound puzzled her. She leaned forward, nose working. Then with care, she yawned, showing small white teeth, and settled again, as if deciding the human noise was harmless, but not impressive. Jonah smiled into the dusk. The chipped green mug waited inside. The hymnals lay on the kitchen table. The bell hung quiet beside him, and beyond the fence, a wild creature with a notched ear sat near enough for him to feel less alone, but far enough to remain herself. That was the joy. Not possession, not miracle. Only a man, a bobcat, an evening prayer, and the mountain holding them both. By the first week of November, the mountain began speaking in sharper sounds. Ice formed along the rim of the water pan before dawn. The creek ran thinner and clearer, its voice clicking over stone like small bones in a pocket. Leaves that had once moved softly now scraped across the yard with a dry, papery sound that made Mercy turn her head even in sleep. Jonah noticed the change in her before he understood it. She still came for the evening bell. Most nights, anyway. She still sat beyond the cedar fence, with her body angled toward the woods, and her scar catching porch light when she turned. But the settled stillness of late October had begun to loosen. She no longer tucked her paws beneath her every time. Sometimes she stood through half the prayer, ears forward, shoulders high. Sometimes her tail tip flicked so often against the frost-burned grass that Jonah could hear it whisper. Once, while he prayed for Mara's animals and Mrs. Calder's hands, Mercy rose without warning and stared toward the ridge. The mountain held its breath with him. Far off, beyond the black gum trees, something called. It was not an owl, not a fox, not a sound Jonah could place with comfort. It came thin and rough through the cold, then broke away into silence. Mercy's whiskers pushed forward. Her ears flattened, then lifted. She opened her mouth slightly, tasting the air. Then she slipped into the laurel and did not return that night. Jonah sat on the bench long after the prayer book had closed. He reminded himself that wild creatures had business no human had the right to understand. Territories shifted. Hunger pulled. Cold pressed animals into strange paths. The ridge belonged to many feet besides hers. Still, the empty place near the cedar post seemed newly fragile, as if the evening had developed a crack. The next morning, the yard was crowded with signs. Mercy's tracks crossed themselves near the fence line, tight and restless. She had paced there after midnight, going from the split cedar post to the water pan and back again. Near the smokehouse, Jonah found marks where she had scraped at the ground with her back paws, covering and uncovering scent. On one fence rail, a tuft of tawny fur clung to a splinter. He did not touch it. Amos, however, seemed to take the whole matter personally. He stood in the coop door and crowed at the fur until one of the hens pecked him on the foot, either in support or exhaustion. Jonah watched this small domestic argument unfold and felt grateful for its foolishness. "All right," he told them. "Nobody asked for your investigation." The hens ignored him with professional skill. Mercy did not appear until noon. She came from the creek side, moving low through the brown weeds. Her healed leg worked well now, but her gait carried a new urgency. She stopped often to listen. Once she climbed the stone wall in a single smooth leap, then crouched there with her belly low and her eyes narrowed toward the ridge. A cold wind lifted the fur along her shoulders. Jonah had been splitting kindling beside the shed. He set the hatchet down quietly. "Something's got you bothered," he said. Mercy did not look at him. She sniffed the air, then rubbed her cheek hard against a fence post, harder than usual. After that, she turned and rubbed the other side too, as if writing herself into the wood in a language only the mountain would read. When a crow flapped out of the pasture and shouted from above, Mercy flicked one ear back with such irritation that Jonah almost smiled. Almost. The worry stayed. That afternoon, he called Mara. She listened the way she had that first rainy day, letting every detail find its place before she answered. "Could be another bobcat moving through," she said. "Could be coyotes. Could be she's expanding her range now that she's stronger. Early cold changes patterns. She seems uneasy." "She probably is." Jonah looked out the kitchen window. Mercy sat beneath the sumac with one paw lifted, not hurt, just paused mid-motion while she watched the woods. "What should I do?" "Same as before," Mara said. "Keep distance. Keep routines. Do not follow her if she leaves. Call me if she looks injured again, or if you see traps, dogs running loose, anything like that." Jonah's hand tightened on the phone. Do not follow her if she leaves. The words were correct. That did not make them gentle. After he hung up, he poured tea into Elisa's chipped green mug and forgot to drink it. Steam rose and faded beside the sink. Outside, Mercy crossed the yard's far edge, then stopped near the prayer bench. For one breath, Jonah thought she might come closer than ever. Instead, she sniffed the bottom step, sneezed softly at some old smell in the wood, and backed away as though the porch had offended her ancestors. Jonah laughed despite himself. The sound loosened something in the room. The warmth beats kept arriving, small and stubborn, even under worry. Caleb Pike left another bag of apples with a note that read, "These are for you, Mr. Hale. If the bobcat reads this, please tell her no." Mrs. Calder sent a jar of pear preserves and claimed the jar was ugly, so he need not return it. Mercy discovered a fallen walnut near the fence, tapped it once with her paw, and jumped back when it rolled downhill. For a few hours, the world seemed almost kind again, but evening brought the ridge call back. Jonah had just rung the bell when it rose beyond the darkening trees, closer this time. Mercy, who had been settling into the grass, stood at once. The porch light touched the pale scar over her eye. Her whole body seemed to lengthen toward the sound. Jonah kept the prayer book open, though the words had emptied from his mind. Mercy took 3 steps away, then stopped. She looked back at him. Not softly, not like a pet asking permission. Her amber eyes were bright with cold, instinct, and some urgency older than any name he had given her. The wildness in her did not ask to be comforted. It asked only not to be mistaken. Jonah understood then how little of Mercy belonged to his evenings. The realization hurt, but it also felt clean. He lowered his head and prayed without looking at her. He prayed for safe paths through laurel, for sharp senses, for hidden dens, for every creature called away from a porch light into the dark work of being alive. When he finished, Mercy was still there, barely, a shadow at the fence, a notched ear, a breath of tawny fur against the frost. Then the ridge called once more. Mercy turned and walked into the trees. The night Mercy disappeared began with a smell of snow. No flakes had fallen yet, but the air carried that clean, hollow scent Jonah had known since boyhood, the kind that made cedar bark seem sharper and chimney smoke hang lower over the yard. Clouds pressed down over the ridge. The pasture looked flattened beneath the coming weather, every weed stem dark against the frost. The chickens went in early without argument, which worried him more than Amos's usual complaints ever had. Even the rooster stepped through the coop door with only one grumble, as if the mountain had spoken in a language poultry understood. Jonah latched the door and laid one hand over the wood. "Good sense for once," he said. Amos answered with a sleepy, offended note. That small exchange should have warmed him. On other evenings, it would have. But Jonah's eyes kept moving toward the ridge. Since the night Mercy had walked into the trees, she had come and gone unevenly. Once she had appeared at noon, mud along her flank and burrs caught in her ruff. Once she had skipped the prayer entirely, then left tracks by the water pan before dawn. Her wild schedule, never his to begin with, had become more secretive. Still, she had always left some sign. A paw print, a cheek mark, a disturbance in the grass. That day, there had been nothing. Jonah checked the water pan and found a skin of ice, unbroken across the top. He cracked it with 2 fingers, lifted the cold pieces aside, and refilled the pan from the kitchen pitcher. A crow called once from the white oak, then flew toward the valley. Inside, the cabin smelled of beans warming on the stove and old paper drying near the hearth. Jonah had been repairing a family Bible from a church in Mill Gap. He had set a weight on the glued seam, then forgotten the work entirely. The prayer book lay beside it, waiting. He ate standing by the sink because sitting at the table felt too much like pretending the evening was ordinary. At dusk, Jonah went out with his coat buttoned high and the little brass bell cold against his palm. Wind moved beneath the boards and found the broken place in the bottom step, making it whine softly. Elise used to tap that board with her heel and say it would sing them into trouble one day. Jonah sat on the prayer bench and waited. The yard darkened. No tawny shape moved at the fence. No notched ear rose among the weeds. The cedar post stood empty, its rubbed patch dull in the fading light. He rang the bell. The note sounded thin in the cold, more fragile than usual. It crossed the yard, touched the fence, and disappeared into the laurel. Jonah listened for the little held breath before Mercy showed herself. Nothing came. He opened the prayer book anyway. The pages lifted in the wind, fluttering under his fingers. For a foolish moment, he imagined Mercy judging him from the dark for losing his place. The thought almost brought a smile. He could picture her narrow-eyed suspicion of the bell, her stern glance at steam, the way she had once tapped a walnut and leapt back from its rolling as though the nut had betrayed all natural law. Those memories made the empty fence harder to bear. He prayed for safe cover. He prayed for sharp ears. He prayed for the ridge and everything moving through it under the first threat of snow. He prayed for the courage not to drag his fear into another creature's freedom. Then the sound came. Not from the ridge this time, from the hollow below the old logging road. A sudden burst of crows lifted out of the trees, harsh and ragged. Beneath them came a crashing in brush, fast and uneven. Jonah stood before he knew he had moved. The prayer book slid from his lap and struck the porch boards with a soft slap. The crashing stopped. The cold seemed to close around the cabin. Jonah stepped to the edge of the porch, one hand on the post. He did not call Mercy's name. He had never spoken it to her. But the name rose in his throat and stayed there, aching. Another sound followed, low, brief, not the strange wrench call of previous nights. Something closer to a growl, cut short, swallowed by distance and brush. Jonah's body wanted to run toward it. Mara's voice came back to him as clearly as if she stood beside the steps. Do not follow her if she leaves. But this was not leaving. Or maybe it was. That was the cruelty of loving a wild thing from a boundary. A man could not always tell the difference between danger and a life he had no right to interrupt. He took one step into the yard. Frost cracked under his boot. The sound stopped him. Mercy knew that yard by silence. If she was near, if she was frightened, his blundering through the dark might drive her farther from whatever safety she still had. If another animal was there, he could make the night worse. Jonah stood shaking in the cold, not from fear for himself, but from the terrible discipline of doing nothing. The crows settled slowly. The woods went still. Snow began, only a few flakes at first, drifting sideways through the porch light. One landed on the open prayer book near Jonah's boot and vanished into the paper. He stayed outside until his hands went numb. Every few minutes, he moved the lantern from one porch rail to the other, as if a small change of light might guide a bobcat who had never asked for guiding. The lantern glass fogged, then cleared. The chipped green mug, forgotten on the railing, filled with snow instead of tea. At last, the cold forced him inside. He left the porch light on. He left the bell hanging free. He left the lowest fence gap untouched. All night, wind pushed snow against the cabin. Jonah sat at the kitchen table, without opening the Bible he was meant to mend. The house made its winter sounds around him, rafters settling, stove ticking, window glass shivering in its frame. Once, near midnight, he thought he heard paws on the porch step and rose so quickly the chair scraped backward. There was only snow. By morning, the yard had turned white. Every old track was gone, and Mercy had left no new one. By sunrise, the snow had softened every edge of the world. Jonah stood on the porch with his coat half buttoned and one hand on the bellpost, staring at a yard he knew well and did not recognize. The cedar fence wore a white cap along each rail. The prayer bench held a shallow drift where he had sat the night before. No tracks crossed the yard. That was what hurt first. Snow usually told the truth by morning. It showed rabbits, mice, raccoons, the whole small night, written plainly for anyone patient enough to read. But Mercy had left nothing. No neat four-toed print at the fence, no place where her body had pressed beneath the cedar post to listen. He fed the chickens in a silence so deep, even Amos seemed uncertain how loudly to object. The rooster stepped into the doorway, saw the snow, and retreated with a cluck that sounded like blame. One hen pecked a snowflake from the ramp and shook her head in personal betrayal. Jonah would have smiled any other day. Instead, he latched the coop and went inside to call Mara. She arrived within the hour, her truck climbing the muddy white drive with chains clicking beneath the tires. She brought a thermos, a canvas pack, and the look of someone used to searching for signs that might not want to be found. "Show me where you heard it," she said. Jonah took her down past the pasture, beyond the fence gap, toward the old logging road where the hollow dropped steeply through laurel and hemlock. Snow fell from branches in cold taps. The woods smelled of wet bark, iron-rich soil, and crushed rhododendron. Mara moved slowly, reading what Jonah could barely see. Here, the snow had been disturbed under a low branch. There, mud showed where something had slid. Near a cluster of rocks, she crouched and brushed snow aside with 2 fingers. "Bobcat," she said. Jonah stopped breathing for half a second. The track was partial, softened by powder, but he saw the rounded toes. No claw marks. Small, careful, angled uphill. "Mercy?" he asked, before he could stop himself. It was the first time Jonah had said the name aloud. Mercy was not his to name. She was a wild female who had survived without his language, except these last strange weeks. But Mara did not correct him. "Could be," she said gently. "The size fits." They followed the broken signs as far as they could. Sometimes the tracks vanished under wind-blown snow and returned beneath laurel. Sometimes there were other marks too, longer and less neat, with claws showing. Mara studied them without dramatizing what she saw. "Coyote passed through here," she said. "Maybe more than one. It doesn't mean they caught her." Caught. The word entered Jonah and stayed cold. He walked with the lantern in one hand, though daylight had come, because leaving it behind had felt wrong. Its little brass frame knocked softly against his knee. The familiar sound gave him one breath that did not hurt. By mid-morning, Caleb Pike came up the drive with his father. Caleb's cheeks were red from cold, and he held a paper sack against his coat. "Mrs. Calder sent biscuits," he said. "She said searching people forget to eat and then become useless." Jonah took the bag. Tucked inside was a note in Mrs. Calder's square handwriting. "For Jonah, Mara, Caleb, and any human who can read. Not for raccoons." Jonah folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. They searched the ridge path, the creek bank, the old deer crossing, and the rock shelf where Mercy had once sat silver-whiskered in frost. They found one tuft of tawny fur snagged on greenbrier, too small to prove anything. They found a hollow beneath roots where something had rested, but whether before or after the snow, no one could say. By afternoon, the mountain had begun thawing in patches. Snow dropped from branches with soft thuds. Water ran under leaves. The clean white world became streaked with mud and shadow, erasing what little story it had told. Jonah felt the old helplessness return. It had the shape of hospital hallways, folded clothes, and Elise's green mug sitting too bright on the sink the morning after the funeral. Mercy had vanished into the kind of loss that gave no proof. The woods had not given him a body, a cry, or a clear trail, only questions. Near the creek, Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out one apple, polished on his sleeve. "I brought this for you," he told Jonah, "not for her. I know she does not eat apples." Jonah accepted it. The apple was red and slightly bruised. He held it like something breakable. "Thank you, Caleb." The boy looked toward the ridge. "Maybe she's just hiding better than we're looking." Mara did not answer too quickly. "That may be exactly right," she said. They searched until the light began to fail. At the cabin, Jonah poured tea for everyone, though his hands shook enough that some spilled onto the counter. Caleb pretended not to notice. Amos, released briefly into the snowy run, strutted along the wire and crowed at the search party as if personally disappointed in their results. Even Mara laughed softly at that. When the others left, Jonah walked them to the porch. Mara promised to check trail cameras near the ridge and return at first light if new signs appeared. Then their taillights went down the drive and vanished between the trees. Jonah was alone with the evening. He sat on the prayer bench while the cold returned. The yard looked bruised where boots had crossed it all day. The water pan reflected a narrow strip of darkening sky. Beyond the fence, the cedar post stood empty. Jonah rang the bell. The note moved out over the snow, over the torn tracks, over the laurel where Mercy had once lain weak and furious with fear. It sounded smaller without her there to hear it. Or perhaps Jonah only felt smaller making it. He opened the prayer book. For a long while, no words came. At last, he bowed his head and whispered the only prayer he had. Let her not be afraid. The woods gave him no answer. Only snowmelt falling from branches. Only the creek. Only an empty place at the fence, holding the shape of a wild creature he had never touched, and somehow missed as if she had sat beside him all his life. For 6 evenings, Jonah rang the bell into absence. Each night, he sat on the prayer bench until the cold worked through his coat and settled behind his ribs. Snow came once more, then turned to rain, then froze along the edges of the water pan. The yard became thawed mud and pale crusts of ice. Mercy did not come. Mara checked 2 trail cameras near the ridge and found deer, a gray fox, 1 wandering hound with no collar, and a raccoon so round and determined that Caleb Pike said it looked like a church deacon late for supper. The raccoon had stood before the camera, paws lifted, eyes bright with criminal purpose. Caleb's father apologized for laughing. Then the silence returned. Jonah went on with chores because animals still needed feeding and wood still needed splitting. He repaired hymnals at the kitchen table. He brewed tea and forgot it beside the sink. He found Caleb's bruised apple in his coat pocket days later and set it on the porch rail, where a chickadee pecked once and fled as if offended by fruit. Amos crowed at his reflection in the ice. Mrs. Calder left soup with a note that said, "Eat before it becomes archaeology." A squirrel dropped a walnut onto the tin roof at dawn and startled Jonah so badly he told the ceiling that was unnecessary. But at dusk, none of it reached the empty place near the cedar post. On the 7th evening, the sky cleared. Cold light spread behind the ridge, thin and silver, turning every branch into a black line. The air smelled of wet bark and chimney smoke. Jonah had spent the afternoon repairing the coop door after Amos discovered a loose board. Now the rooster slept inside, defeated but vocal in dreams, grumbling through the wall. Jonah carried the prayer book outside. He had not expected anything. That was what grief taught after enough repetition. Expectation became too heavy to hold every night, so the heart put it down and walked beside it. He brushed frost from the bench with his sleeve, sat carefully, and reached for the bell. The chain felt colder than usual. He rang once. The bell note moved out soft and bright, crossing the yard, touching the fence, slipping into the laurel. At first, nothing answered. Jonah opened the prayer book to the page he always used. His breath clouded over the paper. One drop from the porch roof struck the step and froze there, a tiny bead of glass. Then the weeds beyond the cedar fence trembled. Jonah did not lift his head quickly. He knew hope could be a loud thing, and loud things frightened what they loved. The trembling stopped. A shadow gathered beneath the split cedar post. Low, small, motionless. The bobcat stepped into the last gray light. Mercy was thinner. That was the first truth. Her sides drew in sharply beneath her spotted coat, and burrs clung along the white ruff at her throat. Mud darkened the fur below one shoulder. Her left ear still carried its V-shaped notch. The scar above her right eye still shone pale. She held one front paw slightly raised, not the old injured leg, but a new tenderness, perhaps from stone or ice. Alive, that was the second truth, and it nearly broke him. Jonah's hand closed around the edge of the prayer book. He did not say her name. The name had escaped him once in the snowy woods, but he would not throw it across the yard now like a rope. He let the silence remain wide enough for her to choose. Mercy stood with her body angled toward the trees. Every part of her seemed prepared to vanish. Her ears moved without rest, one toward Jonah, one toward the ridge, then both toward the creek. Her nose lifted, taking in smoke, chickens, frost, man, bell, memory. She looked at the water pan, looked at the porch, and finally looked at Jonah, not softly, not safely, but knowingly. She lowered herself into the grass, slowly, as though every motion had to be approved by pain. Mercy sat beneath the cedar post where the bell could reach her. Jonah bowed his head before the first tears could gather fully. The prayer that came was not graceful. It was mostly breath, gratitude, and the effort not to frighten a wild creature by loving her too visibly. He thanked the mountain for returning what it could have kept. He asked protection for whatever roads, teeth, storms, and dark hollows she had crossed. He asked forgiveness for every fearful thought that had tried to turn care into possession. Mercy remained. Once during a pause, she bent and licked the raised paw with quick, precise strokes. Then she stopped and stared at a chipped green mug on the porch rail, as if suspicious that tea had continued existing in her absence. Jonah almost laughed, but the sound became something smaller and warmer in his throat. A moth, confused by the porch light and the cold, bumped against the glass shade. Mercy's eyes followed it with tired intensity. She made no leap this time. She only watched, perhaps too worn for nonsense, perhaps wise enough to let one moth survive the evening. Behind the coop wall, Amos muttered in his sleep. Mercy's ear twitched toward him. That little twitch brought Jonah fully back into the world where roosters dreamed angrily, tea went cold, prayer books wore thin, and wild bobcats disappeared because they belonged first to mountains, then returned for reasons no human deserved to simplify. When Jonah finished, the bell was still. He kept his head bowed a little longer. When he raised his eyes, Mercy was still there, seated in the frosted grass, amber eyes half open, breathing, visible in faint white threads. She had not come home. Jonah understood that. She had come near, and near, for a creature like Mercy, was a kind of answer. After several minutes, she stood. She tested the tender paw, placed it down, and moved toward the water pan. She drank only 3 small laps, then lifted her head sharply when a branch cracked in the woods. Jonah did not move. Mercy looked once toward the porch bench, then slipped beneath the lowest fence wire and disappeared into laurel shadow. This time, the yard did not feel empty after she left. It felt held. The morning after Mercy returned, Jonah found 3 new tracks by the water pan. They were pressed into mud where the frost had softened, each one light but clear. She had come before dawn, when the cabin windows were still black, and the stove held only a bed of coals. She had drunk again, perhaps longer this time, then stepped toward the cedar post, paused, and turned back to the woods. Jonah stood over the prints, with his hands tucked beneath his arms, against the cold. The sky was pale, almost colorless. A low mist lay along the creek, and every twig in the pasture wore a bead of water. The world smelled of thawing leaves and wood ash. From the coop, Amos announced the day as if he had invented it. Jonah answered, "You're late." The rooster crowed again, unconcerned by criticism. That small, ordinary noise steadied him. Mercy was alive, but she was not well. A raised paw from the night before stayed in his mind with painful clarity. He wanted to march into the laurel with blankets, medicine, and all the clumsy human certainty he had spent weeks learning to restrain. Instead, he called Mara. She came before noon, parking lower on the drive so the truck would not crowd the yard. Caleb Pike came with her, carrying a small notebook because he said someone ought to keep records. His first entry, written in serious pencil, read, "Bobcat back. Mr. Hale looks less awful." Jonah saw it upside down and decided not to comment. Mara studied the tracks, the water pan, the rubbed cedar post, and a faint line through the weeds where Mercy had passed. She crouched near one print and touched the mud beside it, not the print itself. "Front paw is tender," she said. "Could be a small cut, ice bruise, thorn, anything. If she's eating, drinking, moving, and keeping distance, we watch." "That seems to be the whole work of caring for her," Jonah said. Mara looked up. "Most of it, yes." She helped him set up a better watching place from inside the kitchen, not outside. They moved the small work table closer to the window, away from the direct lamp glow. Mara asked him to keep notes: time seen, gait, appetite, behavior, whether the paw worsened. She left a trail camera tied low to a maple beyond the coop, angled toward the water pan, but not toward the denser woods. "No chasing the picture," she told Caleb. Caleb nodded solemnly, then whispered to Jonah, "That means both of us." Jonah hid his smile by adjusting the curtain. For the next several days, healing became a quiet discipline. Mercy came mostly after dark. The trail camera showed her as a gray shape with bright eyes, stepping carefully, pausing often. She drank. She ate a little of what Mara allowed to be set near the fence. She avoided the brown dish by pulling the food out with one paw, still distrustful of tableware. Once the camera caught her sniffing the dish, backing away, then circling it, as if it might hatch into trouble. Caleb laughed when he saw the image. "She hates that bowl." "She has standards," Jonah said. Those small laughs helped carry the heavier hours. By day, Jonah repaired books and wrote mercy signs in the margin of an old ledger. 5:42 a.m., tracks at water. 7:10 p.m., sat briefly, paw lifted twice. 8:30, ears alert, no labored breathing. The notes were plain, but beneath each line lived a prayer he did not write down. He kept the porch quiet. He did not ring the bell loudly. He did not leave food nearer than before just because she was hurt. When the urge to do more rose in him, he washed the green mug, swept the step, or split kindling until his hands remembered patience. Love, he was learning, could be restless. It wanted proof that it mattered. It wanted a door to open, a body to hold, a wound to bandage. But mercy had survived by not offering her body to human urgency. If Jonah loved her at all, he had to love the distance that kept her herself. On the fourth evening after her return, she came before full dark. A cold pink light rested along the ridge. Jonah sat on the prayer bench with the book closed in his lap, waiting for the hour rather than demanding it. The bell chain rested between his fingers. Mercy emerged from the laurel slowly. Burrs still clung along her ruff, though fewer now. Her spotted coat had begun to smooth where she had groomed herself. She placed the timber paw down, lifted it once, then set it again with more confidence. Jonah's breath left him carefully. She stopped at the cedar post and looked at the porch. "Good," he whispered, so softly the word barely existed. Mercy flicked her notched ear. She was not pleased by praise. Or perhaps she was only offended by the presumption that he had evaluated her. She bent to lick her chest, then sat as if the whole evening had been her idea. Jonah rang the bell. The sound moved across the yard, gentler than snowmelt. Mercy did not flinch. She watched the weeds near her paws, where a beetle struggled over a curled leaf. When the beetle tumbled onto its back, she lowered her head, sniffed it, and sneezed. The beetle righted itself and continued on, spared by the mysterious mercy of a bobcat with larger concerns. Jonah had to pause before praying. His heart had become tender in places he thought had gone numb. That tenderness frightened him. It meant the world could still enter. It meant loss could too. But as Mercy sat beneath the cedar post, scar pale in the dusk, he understood that being breakable was not the same as being ruined. He prayed for healing without capture. He prayed for wisdom without coldness. He prayed for the courage to keep the gate open, even when the open gate hurt. When he finished, Mercy remained through the silence afterward. Then she stood, stretched the tender paw forward, and stepped beneath the fence toward the creek path. Her gait was still careful, but stronger. Jonah watched until the laurel closed behind her. Inside, the kettle began to whistle. Amos muttered in the coop. The green mug waited on the counter, chipped and faithful. For the first time since her disappearance, Jonah let the tea steep properly. The first sign was not mercy. It was the way the songbirds went quiet along the creek on a mild evening 3 weeks after her return. November had softened for a day, offering one last pocket of gentleness before winter settled its full weight. The snow beneath the north-facing trees had shrunk into gray lace. The pasture smelled of wet grass, cedar bark, and apples wrinkling in the basket by Jonah's kitchen door. Low gold light touched the rubbed cedar post where Mercy had left her invisible messages. Jonah had spent the afternoon repairing a cracked leather Bible, while Caleb Pike sat nearby with the wildlife ledger. Beside Mercy's last tracks, Caleb had written Bobcat Mood, and Jonah had quietly added Private. By dusk, Caleb had gone home with 2 biscuits Mrs. Calder claimed were too lopsided for company. Jonah swept crumbs from the step, poured tea into the chipped green mug, and carried the prayer book outside. A small fog lifted from the creek hollow. Jonah sat on the prayer bench with the bell chain loose in his fingers. Waiting no longer felt empty in the same way. It held the possibility of no, the possibility of yes, and the peace of not forcing either one. The weeds near the laurel trembled. Jonah lowered his eyes, giving Mercy room to arrive without the weight of being watched. But the movement did not come from the split cedar post. It came lower, closer to the fern bed, where the fence bent toward the creek. A small shape appeared. Jonah forgot to breathe. The kitten was no bigger than a barn cat's shadow, with oversized paws, round amber eyes, and pale tawny fuzz marked by faint spots. It stepped from the fern stems with unsteady confidence. Its tiny bobtail twitched upright. Behind it came another, then a third. The 3 kittens paused together at the edge of the yard, half hidden among the ferns, all eyes and ears and whiskers. One sat on a dry leaf and startled itself when the leaf crackled. Another attacked a fern stem, lost balance, and rolled into its sibling. The third, smallest of them, remained behind a stone with only its round face showing. Jonah stayed motionless. His hands rested open on the prayer book. His heart had risen so quickly into his throat that it almost hurt. He understood what Mercy had been carrying through the restless weeks, the urgency in her pacing, the reason the ridge had called her away and returned her thinner but alive. She had not vanished from him. She had been pulled deeper into a life larger than him. Mercy emerged last. She stepped from the laurel above the kittens, silent and thin and watchful. Her coat had filled out since the hard days, but motherhood had drawn her sharper around the face. The scar above her right eye seemed brighter in the fading light. Her notched ear turned toward the porch, then toward the ridge, then down to the kittens. She did not look proud. Pride was a human shape. She looked alert, tired, and wholly responsible. One kitten toddled too far into the open. Mercy lowered her head and made a sound Jonah barely heard, a low, breathy chirr that stopped the little one at once. The kitten froze with one paw lifted, then sat down as if sitting had been its plan all along. "Good listening," Jonah whispered, though he did not know whether he meant the kitten or himself. Mercy's eyes moved to him. The yard became still around that look. She had brought them only to the edge, not to the porch, not to the water pan, not into human keeping, just far enough for Jonah to see that the wild had not ended with her fear, her injury, or his prayers. It had continued in secret, in ferns and stone hollows, in milk and warmth and small bodies pressed together against cold nights. Jonah felt humbled in a way that was almost prayer before the bell. He thought of Elise then, not with the sharp stab that used to come, but with a broad ache. They had never had children, though they had hoped once. The years had answered differently. They had filled the cabin with books, neighbors, and small kindnesses. Still there had been an empty room in both of them they rarely named. Watching Mercy's kittens stumble through the ferns, Jonah felt that room open, not to claim what he had missed, but to bless what existed beyond him. The smallest kitten sneezed. All 3 siblings startled. Mercy did not. Jonah pressed his lips together. The smallest kitten sneezed again, then looked surprised by its own nose. Another kitten pounced on a curl of bark and carried it 3 steps before dropping it on its own foot. The boldest one sniffed a frost-bent aster, recoiled, and gave the flower a tiny swat. Jonah rang the bell at last, softer than ever. The note crossed the yard. The kittens froze. 6 little ears pointed toward the porch. Mercy stood over them, body ready, but she did not gather them away. She watched Jonah, measuring the sound she had chosen for herself and now allowed near her young. Jonah bowed his head. His prayer changed shape around them. He did not ask that the kittens come closer. He did not ask to see them again, though every lonely part of him wanted that. He asked for hidden dens, quiet hunters' roads, clear water, and the wisdom of mothers. He asked that his yard remain only an edge, safe enough to pass, never sweet enough to trap. When he opened his eyes, the 3 kittens were nursing at the edge of the fern bed, while Mercy stood above them like a small guardian carved from dusk. After a few breaths, she nudged them one by one toward the laurel. The bold kitten resisted long enough to bite a fern. Mercy lifted it gently by the scruff and carried it 2 steps, which ended the rebellion with limp surrender. Jonah's eyes warmed. He did not wipe them. The laurel received them slowly, first the smallest face, then the spotted backs, then Mercy's notched ear. Before she vanished, Mercy turned once toward the bench. Jonah kept still. Then she was gone. The fence stood empty again, but not lonely. Somewhere beyond it, 3 new lives rustled beneath leaves, and Jonah sat with the bell cooling in his hand, feeling the prayer circle widen without a creature crossing the line. Winter did not arrive all at once in Briar Hollow. It came in careful layers. First, the creek edges crusted white at dawn. Then the north pasture held snow long after the road had turned back to mud. By December, the ridge wore a pale cap, and the cabin windows bloomed with frost while the kettle worked itself toward a whisper. The yard had changed. The fence still leaned slightly near the laurel. The prayer bench still sat beside the porch steps, worn smooth where Jonah and Elise had once sat shoulder to shoulder. Amos still believed every sunrise required his personal announcement, and the hens still considered Jonah's bootlaces suspicious. But the place no longer felt like a cabin at the end of a road. It felt like an edge shared carefully by many lives. Mercy brought the kittens back only when she chose. Sometimes a week passed with no sign except a track under the lowest fence wire or a faint cheek rub on the cedar post. Then, on an evening cold enough to turn Jonah's breath blue in the porch light, the ferns would tremble and the 3 small faces would appear in a row, solemn as judges. They had grown quickly. The bold one, whom Caleb privately called Button because it fastened itself to trouble, pounced on everything that moved and several things that did not. The smallest stayed close to Mercy's flank, watching with round amber eyes before stepping into open grass. The middle kitten sat suddenly, as if overwhelmed by the responsibility of legs. Caleb understood the rule, though he struggled with it. He came up some Saturdays with his notebook tucked into his coat and wrote descriptions instead of names. One kitten attacked dry grass. One kitten listened hard. One kitten forgot where feet go. Jonah read the line and had to lean against the doorframe until his smile settled. Mrs. Calder found out in the way women like Mrs. Calder found out everything, without being told and with a casserole already prepared. She climbed the porch one afternoon, set a covered dish in Jonah's hands, and said, "For you. Not for bobcats, not for raccoons, not even for that rooster." Amos crowed from the coop as if answering a legal accusation. Mercy watched Mrs. Calder from the laurel that day. The bobcat did not run, but she kept herself deep in cover, only the scar above her right eye visible between leaves. Mrs. Calder saw the amber glint and softened all the way down to silence. "Well," she whispered, "a mother knows, A mother. Jonah did not ask what she meant. Some griefs, like some tracks, were best approached lightly. Mara continued to visit, less as a rescuer now than as a guardian of the boundary. She checked that Jonah had not let affection make him careless. He had not. Food assistance had ended as Mercy hunted well again. The water pan remained through freezing weather, broken open each morning with a wooden spoon Jonah kept by the door. The spoon became one more household oddity, like the cracked lantern, the green mug, and Caleb's notes. On bright afternoons, Jonah saw signs of Mercy's strength returning. She crossed the stone wall with a single clean leap. She carried herself low and smooth through the sumac. Once, she crouched by the creek, sprung into the reeds, and came up with nothing but icy grass. She looked so displeased with the creek that Jonah said, "It owed you better." Mercy shook one wet paw and walked away with dignity. The kittens practiced being wild in clumsy pieces. They stalked leaves. They attacked one another's tails. They climbed a fallen log and then had to think carefully about how to get down. Button once crept toward the water pan, saw his own reflection under thin ice, and slapped it with both front paws. The ice cracked, the kitten sprang backward, and Mercy gave him one long look that seemed to contain every tired thought of motherhood. Jonah laughed into his scarf. That laugh carried farther now. It did not mean he had stopped missing Elise. Her absence remained in the cabin, in the empty hook by the stove, in the second dent on the prayer bench, in the green mug he still turned so the chip faced his palm. But the missing no longer filled every room to the ceiling. There was space around it. Space for Caleb's pencil scratches, Mrs. Calder's bossy kindness, Mara's quiet checks, Amos's complaints, and Mercy's wild families flickering at the edge of dusk. Evening prayers became slower. Jonah still rang the little brass bell, but he often waited until Mercy had settled the kittens in the ferns. The sound no longer startled them. Their ears lifted, their bodies froze, and then, if their mother stayed calm, they relaxed by degrees. The smallest kitten once fell asleep sitting up, head drooping forward until its nose touched a leaf. It woke with such surprise that Caleb, watching from inside the dark kitchen, had to cover his mouth. Jonah prayed with the porch light low. He prayed for hunters to aim carefully and drive slowly. He prayed for clear dens, full bellies, and snow that hid what needed hiding. He prayed for human hands to know when to open and when to fold quietly in their own laps. Sometimes he prayed for Elise and felt not an answer exactly, but a gentleness around her name. One evening, near Christmas, Mercy stepped closer than she ever had with the kittens behind her. She stopped 5 long paces from the bottom step. Jonah did not move. His hands rested on the prayer book. The bell hung silent. The night smelled of pine smoke and coming snow. Mercy looked at him, scar pale, notch sharp, amber eyes reflecting the porch light without surrendering to it. Then she sat. Behind her, 3 kittens tumbled through the frosted grass, turning the solemn moment into a small disaster of pause. Button climbed over his sibling. The middle one sneezed. The smallest tried to hide behind Mercy's tail and failed because the tail was too short. Jonah bowed his head so his smile would not frighten them. The prayer circle had widened, but it remained a circle with open edges. No one crossed what should not be crossed. No one claimed what should not be claimed. The mountain kept its children, the cabin kept its bell, and Jonah kept his place on the bench, grateful to sit near what would never belong to him. Years later, people in Briar Hollow still knew when Jonah Hale's day was ending. Not because he announced it. Jonah never became that sort of man. But just before dark, when the ridge turned purple and the creek took on the color of pewter, A small brass bell would ring from the porch of the cabin above the county road. Its note was thin in winter, softer in summer, and often nearly lost beneath cicadas, rain, or the low complaint of wind in the cedar fence. Still, it rang. The prayer bench had been repaired at last, though not replaced. Caleb Pike, taller now and away at college most months, had insisted on helping one spring. He sanded the old boards, tightened the legs, and patched the broken step that used to whine in the cold. Jonah watched him work with the guarded patience of the man allowing someone else to mend a thing he had been meaning to fix for 10 years. "You know," Caleb had said, holding up a bent nail, "this porch was mostly faith and habit." Jonah had looked toward the fence. "So are many good things." Caleb had laughed, but quietly, because by then he understood the yard's rules. Mercy had not lived at the edge of the cabin forever. No wild creature owed forever to any human place. Her kittens had grown lean and strong, losing their baby roundness by late spring. Button, who had never admitted that his name was Button because no one had spoken it aloud, became the first to vanish into his own territory. The careful middle kitten followed the creek for weeks before disappearing beyond Mill Gap. The smallest stayed nearest through that summer, appearing now and then on the rock shelf where Mercy had once watched the frost. Mercy herself came less often as seasons turned. At first, Jonah looked for her every evening with an ache he tried to keep gentle. Then he learned to look without reaching. Some nights there were tracks, some nights a cheek mark on the cedar post, some nights only the feeling that the woods had held its breath near the fence and moved on. The last time Jonah saw her clearly, it was early September. Goldenrod stood high along the pasture, bees working the yellow plumes in the warm light. The air smelled of dry grass and distant rain. Jonah had been sitting on the bench with the prayer book closed, waiting for dusk, but not hurrying it, when Mercy stepped from the laurel. She was older then, not old, but seasoned. Her coat had darkened along the spine. The scar above her right eye remained pale, and the V-notch in her left ear made her unmistakable even at a distance. She moved without a limp, low and sure, every step belonging to the mountain. She came to the cedar post and rubbed her cheek against the smooth place worn by years of her own passing. Then she sat. Jonah's hands rested on the prayer book. The chipped green mug cooled beside him. Amos was gone by then, buried under the apple tree after a final summer of complaints. But one of his grandsons crowed from the coop with almost the same offended timing. Mercy's ear twitched toward the sound. Jonah smiled. "Runs in the family." The bobcat looked at him as if she had never approved of roosters in any generation. He rang the bell. The note opened into the gold evening, and for a few minutes the years folded themselves gently together. The rainy day beneath the laurel, the first 3 feet of trust, the empty snow, the return, the 3 kittens tumbling through frost. Elisa's name, once too sharp to speak, now resting softly in Jonah's prayers like a candle protected from wind. He prayed without asking Mercy to stay. That was how he knew the prayer had grown honest. When he finished, Mercy remained through the silence. Then she rose, turned toward the woods, and paused beside the lowest fence rail. She looked back once, amber eyes catching the porch light. Not farewell, perhaps. Humans had a habit of making farewells out of any backward glance. But Jonah received it with the humility of a man who knew a gift when it was not addressed in words. Mercy slipped into the laurel. She did not return to sit through evening prayer again, but she did not vanish from the place. In winter, tracks crossed the upper pasture after snow, sometimes hers, sometimes another bobcat's, sometimes too wind-blurred to know. In spring, Jonah found young Prince near the creek and wondered if one of Mercy's grown kittens had passed through with kittens of her own. He never told the story too loudly. He told it only when asked gently, and never as proof that wild things loved people the way people wanted to be loved. She chose the edge, he would say. That was enough. Mrs. Calder grew slower, but still sent food with labels warning raccoons away. Mara retired from field rescues and began teaching younger rehabilitators, though she drove up once each winter to drink tea and check the old fence with Jonah. Caleb brought his wife years later and showed her the cedar post as if introducing her to a family elder. Jonah kept the lowest fence gap open. Sometimes, on damp mornings, he found the grass bent beneath it and stood there with his coat unbuttoned, letting hope pass through him without grabbing hold. He had become better at that. He could let a sign be only a sign, not a promise, not a debt. Once, a young bobcat with no scar crossed the far pasture at dawn and vanished before the sun touched the fence. Jonah smiled and did not follow. He kept the wooden spoon by the door for breaking ice on the water pan. He kept Elise's green mug, chip turned toward his palm. And every evening, as long as his hands could manage the bell chain, he sat on the prayer bench and let the little note travel toward the trees. The woods never answered in words. They answered in other ways. A paw print before dawn, a rustle in fern, a notched memory moving through dusk, a man no longer afraid of an empty bench. Now, the porch light softened, and the story drew back from the cabin the way evening drew back from the last gold on the fence. The prayer bench stayed there beside the steps, holding the shape of all who had rested near it. Elise in memory, Jonah in patience, Mercy in the grass beyond, and 3 spotted kittens who once turned a solemn winter prayer into a tumble of paws. The little brass bell did not sound loudly. It never had. It was only a small note offered to a large mountain. But sometimes the smallest sounds were the ones that stayed. They entered cedar bark, frost, creek mist, and the quiet places where wild creatures passed unseen. Mercy remained wild. That was the piece of it. She was never carried inside, never made into a pet, never asked to trade the dark safety of Laurel for the comfort of walls. She gave Jonah what she could give without losing herself. Nearness, attention, a season of shared dusk, and the reminder that love did not always meet a hand laid upon it. So let the final picture be simple. An old man sat with a chipped green mug, cooling beside him. A bell hung still from a porch post. Beyond the cedar fence, the woods gather blue and deep. Somewhere, maybe close and maybe far, a bobcat moved through the ferns with silent feet, and the mountain kept her passage safe. Thank you for staying with this quiet story until the night settled. May your own heart remember the animals that once sat near your life, whether for years or only for one unforgettable evening. Rest gently now. Let the porch light fade. Let the creek keep speaking. Let the wild remain wild and loved beneath the stars. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.